Now, while the median house price in Sydney has climbed to $1 million, there are still places where you can snag a bargain for under $250,000. It sounds too good to be true. Well, our property expert and co-host of Location, Bryce Holdaway, joins us now from Melbourne. $250K, that's what you'd expect to pay for a garage in some Australian cities. Tell us where you can get these sort of bargains.
Yeah, well, from the perspective of Sydney, you'd certainly be getting a garage, but there are places around the country where you can get it for $250, like Edge Hill in Cairns. You can buy a unit. You can buy out just on the outskirts of Bendigo. You can buy a house. You can also buy in South Tamworth. But I think the important point here is these examples that I'm giving, where the median price is around that $250 level. But I was in Adelaide a couple of weeks ago, looking around for a couple of days. You can actually still buy close to the CBD of Adelaide for around $250,000. So despite the fact that it's almost $1 million in Sydney, there are places where you can get it.
Yeah, you've got to look around, I guess, is the key. People, though, they're struggling to save money for the deposit that they need. How much do people need to be earning to get in on the property game, do you think?
Look, it all comes down to a combination of two things. How much do you earn and how much equity do you have? So I think for most people, the difficulty is actually getting the equity, because if prices are actually running away, saving for a deposit, they're actually going to take longer to save for a deposit than they, I mean, the prices are going to go at a faster rate than they can actually save. So if they don't get involved with sort of mortgage insurance where they're sort of borrowing 90 to 95%, they're probably going to have to look to maybe get some help from mum and dad to get into the market, because essentially I see the equity as being the hardest part to get in, more so than the income.
Yeah, and that's the key, having that big chunk of cash to play with to begin with. And that's where a lot of parents are concerned, not just first home buyers, about how it's so different to when they were trying to buy their first home.
Yeah, and I mean, the normal thing in the market is you normally got about 70% of the market is buying a house to live in and 30% to invest. That's sort of equilibrium. And in recent times, that's been investors have been as high as 50, almost 60%, which is really out of equilibrium with where it's normally meant to be. And for investors, they're usually using equity that they've already got to get into the marketplace. So they've got an advantage over the first-time buyer or someone who's trying to upgrade from sort of lower in the property ladder. So it can be quite difficult. And I think some of the changes that have happened with APRA to try and take some of the heat out of the investment market is probably a positive thing to sort of bring it back to that 70-30 equilibrium.
All right, so equity is one thing. What are some of your other tips for people who want to try and build a property portfolio?
Yeah, look, definitely having equity, saving a deposit. I think the other one is to maybe ask mum and dad if they can borrow some of their equity and go as guarantor to get in. But I think one of the biggest things is to prepare for interest rate rises at a higher level than they currently are, because the long-term interest rate average is 7.25, and we're consistently lower than that right now. So I think you need to pressure test your budget at a higher level to make sure that any sort of adverse movements in interest rates won't see your portfolio come crashing down. You've really sort of put a buffer in place to protect yourself from that. The other one I say is searching online is not research. There's so much more to finding out what is a good property. I always say location does 80% of the heavy lifting, so you've got to really unpack the suburb and the location as to why you should be investing there, rather than just looking online at the online portals and seeing what you should buy. And my third tip is essentially making sure that I guess getting into the market it's not for the faint-hearted. I think that if you're in Sydney right now, it's probably not the best place to be considering investing. So be a borderless investor. If you've got some equity in Sydney, maybe consider buying in Brisbane, or maybe consider buying in Adelaide, where the opportunities are at a more affordable level. All
right, good tips. What about the traps?
Look, I think one of the biggest traps right now, particularly for people living in Sydney, is the fear of missing out. And that's because they perceive everyone's having this party and they want to get on board, and they're taking advice from the hairdresser or the taxi driver that they should be buying property. So for me, that's the big one. There's so much more to getting into property than just buying and signing on the dotted line. So don't get caught up in FOMO. And I also think that when people are investing in a property, quite often it may be just a conversation where they say, hey, there's a property down the road that's for sale, you should buy that as an investment property. And they go, okay, that's a good idea. But it's actually a process, not an event. There's so much that you need to do in advance of buying a property before you actually sign on the dotted line. So that's really important. And my last one is make sure that you know what's involved in buying property, because just because you live in one doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to invest in one. There's a lot involved.
Yeah, you've got to take your heart out and use your head in a lot of these investment decisions. And just finally, the property bubble, we're always being told that we're in the middle of one, it could burst. What do you think?
I don't think we're in a property bubble, but I think there's cause for concern. The biggest challenge is Australia's not just one big market. It's actually probably two tiers at the moment, Melbourne and Sydney and the rest of the country. And I guess there's probably cause for some concern in the Sydney and Melbourne market. But I guess anything that the regulatory authorities do to impact on those two cities will actually negatively impact on the cities that need the help the most. Because you've got the other capital cities as well as the regional locations that could really do with some injection of activity into their marketplaces. So I guess I don't think there's a bubble, but I think there's some cause for some concern with some of the prices moving away. And as I said before, if we've got sort of investors in the market close to 50 and 60%, that's unsustainable. So we really need to bring that back so that the investors aren't sort of the dominant player in the market. And I think the changes that APRA have made in terms of making it more difficult for the serviceability calculators, they're taking away more of the investors' ability to borrow at high gearing, high sort of 90 to 95% LVRs. And I actually think that's a good thing because it takes a little bit of the heat out. So my view is we're not in a bubble, but I think the things that they're doing now to take a bit of the heat out of the market are a good thing.
All right, good advice. Thanks so much, Bryce. And for more tips, you can grab a copy of this month's issue of Money magazine.